All right, let's go ahead and talk about physical and chemical properties. Now, physical and chemical properties is similar to physical and chemical changes, except for we're dealing with a characteristic that a substance has. And so, to give you a refresher on what physical and chemical changes are, a physical change is a change in the substance where you do not get a new substance. For example, if you rip a piece of paper, you're changing the paper, but it's still paper. An example of a chemical change would be if you burned that paper. Now we're going to talk about physical and chemical properties, which is a little bit different because it talks about the characteristics of that particular substance. So first off, to describe what a physical property is, it's something that can be measured or observed without a change occurring. And so let's go ahead and take a look at this right here. It's a piece of paper, and when we observe the paper, we observe that it's white. And when we observe that, it's not changing. So that would be a physical property of it. We also observe that it's malleable. It's not changing when we observe that. We also observe that it can be folded and so on. Now, a chemical property is a property in which when you observe it, when you observe that it has that property, it's changing when you observe that. So for example, what type of property does this have that when we observe it, it's changing? Well, an example would be it's flammable. So this being flammable, when we observe that it's flammable, it will be changing. And so that is a chemical property. So let's go through some examples of physical properties. An example would be color. Another example would be if it's lustrous or not. For example, this pen right here has got this shiny part and it's lustrous, but it's also got this other part here, this black part, which is not so lustrous. Hardness is an example as well. So if we observe that something is hard, it's not changing. Conductivity, so some substances can conduct electricity, and when it does conduct electricity, it's not changing. If it has magnetism, if we observe that something's magnetic, it's not changing when we observe that. If something is able to bend, it's malleable. You can bend it. And if something can be stretched into a thin wire, we say that it's ductile. And so a lot of metals are able to be stretched into a thin wire, which we say is ductile. Now some examples of chemical properties. Again, a chemical property is when you observe it, it's changing. So combustibility. Combustibility is an example of that. It's the ability of a substance to burn or ignite. Reactivity is an example. If you were to leave this just sitting on the table, it's not necessarily going to rust, but if you were to leave maybe a piece of metal on the table over time, it will rust, and so that's a different type of reactivity. Toxicity is an example as well. If I were to eat this paper, it's not necessarily going to be toxic to me, but if I were to maybe swallow a battery, that would be toxic. And the ability for something to go through decomposition. And so these are all examples of chemical properties. Now there's some other ones as well, but this is just a general list, and then the same thing with physical properties, a general list as well. Now, let's go ahead and go through two practice problems, and then there's some other practice problems that are similar within the booklet there. The first one is water has a density of 1 gram per centimeter cubed. Now, when we observe that it has a certain density, is the water changing? Well, the answer is no, it's not changing, which means that it's a physical property, because when we observe that, it doesn't change. And density is the word that we are talking about in this situation. Now for number 2, it says the flash point of alcohol is 79 degrees Fahrenheit. Too sure, but anyways, the flash point is the temperature at which a substance will combust. And so when a substance reaches that temperature, it will spontaneously combust. And so when we observe that alcohol is combustible at that point, is that changing the identity of it? It is. It is changing the identity because it's burning. And so that is going to be a chemical property of it. And that happens, the key word that we're talking about is flash point. So the property we're talking about is flash point. And that is all there is to chemical and physical properties. Again, it's if we observe the property and it's not changing when we observe it, it's going to be a physical property, and if it is changing, it's going to be a chemical property.